So we're on to our next part. We have Dan Yergin. Dan, are you there? Are you available? I think you unmute. Okay. Great.
I'm now unmuted.
Great. So let me introduce Dan Yergin. He is a man who clearly needs no introduction, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the author of the prize, which is, unlike A Brief History of Time, a book everyone has on their coffee table that they've actually read. And he's out with a new book called The New Map. And the new map is Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. And I encourage everyone to go, go buy it. I think many of the things are very analytical, but the stories he tells of how we got here are very much, I think, in line with the way we're thinking. I also would like to say that Dan wrote another book besides the prize in this great book of The Quest, as well as The Commanding Heights. So I thank you, Dan, for letting us steal it from, I think it was Stalin or Lenin first, and now from you. So I appreciate you letting us steal the title. So Dan's going to share with us some remarks about the new book, about the energy landscape we're in, and then we'll be able to take some questions. So please do send in some questions. We want this to be interactive. I know it's hard with Zoom, but we think this is a great opportunity to talk to a luminary in this space. Okay, Dan.
Thank you very much, Robbie. And of course, I'm thrilled to be at a conference called The Commanding Heights of Transportation. And thank you for using the title. It does come to us from Lenin through the British Labour Party, the Indian Congress Party, through my book, The Commanding Heights, to SAFE and Robbie Diamond. So it has a great fraternity there. I presume you've already expressed your thanks to Governor Gavin Newsom for doing that advanced publicity and promotion for the conference today. It was so well timed, and I'm sure it was strategized like that. And I am very pleased to be here. I've known SAFE really from the beginning and know what really important work it does, both in terms of policy and research and bringing them together and advancing the discussion. And you've certainly done that with this new study, The Commanding Heights of Transportation. To which I, many congratulations on the work and the timeliness of it. And it fits into the themes of the new map, which talks about, and the new map is the new map of energy and geopolitics, how they come together. And there's been this tendency for geopolitics to be over there and energy transition over there, but now they've come together, and they've come together in your study, and they're coming together in the world themselves because of the shifts that are going on. And so I think the study is a real contribution. The energy transition, I'm going to talk a little bit about it and transportation. The energy transition is the scale of it is, I think, sometimes not taken into account. If you wanted to really go all wind and solar to meet sort of goals that are out there, you would have to add twice as much capacity as the entire current electric power generating industry throughout the entire world. And that would involve a lot of minerals, a lot of mining. It would move us into an era in the new map that I call an era of big shovels, because so much is there. And of course, that ties in with what you're focused on. The other thing about the scale of the energy transition is that, we had an $87 trillion economy before COVID. And that economy ran 84% on fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. So it's not something that you can just shift quickly, but the direction is clear. And one thing that SAFE is focused on from the beginning, and that I go back to again and again, is that so much of energy security is about diversification, of not being overly reliant in any direction. And Robbie and I were talking about a line that I have from Winston Churchill in the prize, actually, where he was talking about Britain making that big decision to convert its battleships from coal to oil before the First World War. And people said, you're going to rely on oil and from a country called Persia, now known as Iran. And Churchill said something that I think is really the byword of energy security. He said, safety lies in variety and variety alone, diversification. And I think what this study is about, and what SAFE has been about, is diversifying transportation sector in particular to to build security and resilience into it. In the new map, I lay out a vision that I think is not so far from what SAFE sees. I call it the new triad. And my book is divided into different, quote, maps. And the term map is really metaphorical. But America's map, China's map, Russia's map, but roadmap to the future. And it's really the new triad, I call it, because it's really three things coming together, which SAFE has focused on for some time. One are EVs, electric vehicles. And it is striking that at this point in time, half the world's EVs are in China. And China, more than any other country, has made a commitment to it. And I think there's multiple reasons for it. Certainly, one is urban pollution. Behind that's climate, but I think it's really urban pollution. Secondly, is dependence on imported oil, and that's rising. And 75% of China's oil is imported, and a good part of it to a part of the world that Admiral Blair knows very well, the South China Sea and through the Malacca Straits. And in the book, I quote former Chinese president talking about the Malacca dilemma depending upon it. And I think there's a third reason for the Chinese commitment to EVs, which is the word leapfrog. They're not going to be able to catch, they have the world's largest automobile market by far. And in all the discussion of decoupling, you kind of lose sight how important the Chinese market is to American companies. But in terms of leapfrogging, they're not going to catch up and be a global competitor with the internal combustion engine. They can buy Volvo and other things, but they're not going to be at the forefront. But I think their strategy is that they could push ahead with electric vehicles from a global market point of view. That will enable them to leapfrog kind of to the forefront of that. So that's put them out front. Obviously, as that decision yesterday or the executive order in California says, push to EVs, but still a really small part of the fleet at this point. But you take EVs, combine it with the second thing, which is ride hailing, which has obviously taken a hit during COVID, but will come back. And then third is autonomous vehicles. Although I noticed when one of the great people, I talked to many people really in the thick of things for the book. One of them is Sebastian Thrun, who was led the Google's entry into what became Waymo. And by the way, there's a great picture of him in the book, in the new map, when they won one of the prizes for autonomous vehicles. He calls them self-driving cars. But you take the three of them together, and you have a different kind of auto industry, presumably over times. It's one in which software becomes a much more fundamental to running these whole systems of self-driving electric taxis, basically, that pick people up. And so I posit in the book that big oil may be succeeded by something else, which will be called big mobility. And who knows, maybe big mobility will be a target of congressional investigations in 10 or 12 years. But that's what's happening on the energy side. I would say that there has, until this study work we're doing called the New Supply Chains for a Zero Carbon Future, there's been not much attention to the nature of the supply chains. But I think that now that's happening as we see the growing tension in the relationship with China. In the book, I describe what I call the WTO consensus. It's kind of a term I invented to describe the state of mind from the end of the 1990s, beginning of 2000 when China joined the WTO, to about, I think different people on this call may have different views of it, but I think it really predates the Trump administration, a sense that that WTO consensus was coming undone on the US side because of things like the South China Sea, but also about intellectual property and the growing sense of a technology race, which has come to the fore. And that WTO consensus is clearly today given away to something else called a strategic rivalry or great power competition. You know that those words have echoes of earlier eras that ended quite badly. But it's not, is it, it's already a question, is it really becoming a new Cold War, or is there going to be a Cold War? Well, it's going to be a lot more complicated than the Soviet American Cold War, which was really based upon nuclear weapons. Here you have the two largest, and by the way, the Soviet Union was not a very important factor in the world economy, actually. Here you have the two largest economies in the world that have, their growing differences. And I think the last few months have really accelerated that. And yet at the same time are much more interconnected than people recognize. I think many people would be surprised to know that in their 401k plans or their pension plans, they're Chinese companies. And we've seen kind of the unraveling of some of that, the question of Chinese students in the United States. I think the Wuhan, the virus that began in Wuhan has, if you say, what are the consequences of it? We can point to what it means for transportation, for commuting, for digitalization, but it also has accentuated the split and the tensions between the United States and China. We're not seeing a cooperative approach. So it is very, it's going to be very difficult, I think, period, to get it right. But I think, I think what this study's done and other things, it just said, there are issues around the supply chains that you need to be aware of. I noticed the EU came out with a report. The EU has very advanced goals for net zero carbon by 2050, not very clear of how to get there. And I think they've just sort of looked at the supply chains and have to look at what the costs would be, particularly in a post-COVID era when governments have such staggering levels of debate. But challenge, and I think this is an important contribution and it's an important discussion to how to manage the supply chains at a time when rivalry is growing greater, and do so, manage them in a way that promotes stability rather than accentuating tensions, that reduces the potential for tensions. And at the same time, I think the very big issue, maybe the most important geopolitical question of the 21st century is how do you manage the geopolitical relationships between China and the United States? Thank you.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. You were at our first event when we did our first oil shockwave, and here you are. So you were at the launch of the Electrification Coalition. So I really do appreciate all the intellectual guidance you've provided us. I have a couple questions, some from the audience, some from me. My first question is regarding conversations you've had about electric vehicles inside, let's say, oil companies or countries that sell a lot of oil. You have the luxury, the ability to talk to massive oil companies, countries that most of their revenue comes from oil. So I'd be curious, has their view of EVs changed over, and what flipped that, if it did flip from it's a joke to something that they basically are serious
well,
about?
I think it's the recognition that there was a pre-Paris and the post-Paris eras in energy, and the way it's being adopted by governments, by investors, and by companies themselves. So I think if you look at European companies and you look at what BP has said, they want to shift from hydrocarbons to be more electricity. They talk about their charging business and so forth. So that's in one direction. Obviously people probably don't know this. The lithium ion battery was really invented in an Exxon laboratory in 1976 when it thought the world was going to run out of oil, and you needed to sort of move in this direction. And there had been a previous boomlet in EVs that faded when oil prices came down. But I think that over the last 2 years, it's seen that this is just more, the world is moving in this direction. At IHS Markit, we estimate, we have a big automotive research group, several hundred people. And at this point, the assumption is we go from 1.4 billion cars today to about 2 billion in 2050. About 1/3 of them will be EVs, which means that still 1.3, 1.4 will still be gasoline because cars stay on the road a long time, 12 years. But by 2050, 60 to 80% of new cars being sold will be electric vehicles. And the push that's coming from the automobile companies, the pressure that the EU, I have in the new map describing what the European Union is doing in terms of the penalties that will be imposed on automobile companies that do not move towards low carbon vehicles. So, but then that does get into the question about what are the supply chains, what's going to be the availability of resources. But I think that, and among oil exporting countries, I think some in the Middle East see it more vividly. I had a piece a week and a half ago in the Wall Street Journal about energy security, and it began with the CEO of an Middle East oil company stopping in Washington, and we met over on 24th Street for coffee, and he didn't want to talk about Iran. He didn't want to talk about the price of oil. He wanted to talk about how many Teslas he'd seen in California. So I think the mental map is changing, and people are looking at the price of Tesla stock and saying, what's it telling you about the future?
Thank you. I have a question about peak demand. When we first met, people were talking about peak supply, and now I think you were one of the first to talk about peak demand. And that BP's recent analysis showing that automation and solar and electrification drives this even faster. Just do you believe it's already occurred? And,
no.
And what's
no.
the
well?
What's the
I think it's too soon to generalize when we're still in COVID as to what changes. Some changes we know are very clear in terms of digitalization, and I think that BP is probably there may be people from BP on this call influenced by the change in work behavior. The sense that people are going to work at home. I think BP's announced that some significant number of its employees will work at home. There'll be less commuting. But if you look at their scenarios, there's one that shows a very sharp fall, one that shows somewhat of a fall, and one that shows it sort of kind of moderating out over time. And I think we're still in the world of trying to assess the scenarios. The one that got the most attention that said, it's already peaked and or will peak in the next couple of years. I think I would still conceptually just still use the view that I have in the new map that probably the peak is in the first half of the 2030s. And then it slides down, it doesn't plummet down. Also, by the way, oil is used for a lot of other things like, the tools that put stents into people's hearts and plastics and so forth, which have kind of their value has been reinforced by their role in helping to manage the crisis in terms of health.
Dan, I have two more questions, and then we're going to turn to Congressman Curtis, who's sitting in our green room. My first question is from the audience as well. Do you have any perspective on the difference between Japan in the 80s and our fears of what they're doing versus now we're all talking about China? Clearly our reports on China. And is this just the same old, or is China different? Like, how do you see the similarities or the differences?
Well, there are some, I haven't thought about some superficial similarities. There was a book that was published by a Harvard professor in the late 80s called Japan as Number One. When it got published in Japan, it was translated as Japan is Number One. And that kind of rang the bell because then they just started their decline. But there, when they bought Rockefeller Center, everybody said this is the end, they're going to take over. It turned out it was a really bad real estate deal for Japan. I think this is different because that was there was the fear of technology and imports, of course, in Japanese cars, but there wasn't the sense that, Japan was still an ally. Here now, that the coming apart of the WTO consensus, Hong Kong, a whole host of other things have accentuated, and there's always a question of Taiwan. So I think the scale of this, there's some superficial similarities, but I think, nobody looked at Japan in the late 1980s and saw it as a geopolitical rival, trying to create its own order. You didn't have China and Japan and Russia coming together, where you now have China and Russia coming together. So I think there I think the differences are more significant than the similarities. But I think the one thing is that, we should have confidence in ourselves and not go into a panic, but rather understand the situation and what do we do about it. I think that's one of the things your study is trying to convey.
You're an expert in oil markets and oil history. I'm curious what you think about, we when we started and we first met, oil supplies were going down, imports are going up. That's totally changes in your book, talking about the fracking revolution. In fact, that's where you start. But at the same time, we still have the exact volatility we've had before at a global price. And I think it's safe. We've, labored a long time saying, yeah, it's good for balance of payments, but we're still, and as Adam Goldstein said before, as Adam Goldstein said before, we see it on the upside and the downside now, which is even worse, when prices are high and low. Just what's your sense of what is oil dependence? Like, is Russia and Saudi Arabia more oil dependent than us because that's where their revenue from?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that we saw this spring when oil prices went to zero, kind of a president who said, I always hated OPEC, realized that actually this is a pretty important sector of the economy. When oil prices used to go down, it was great for the United States because we were importing most of our oil. It meant money stayed in this economy, and it was like a tax cut. But now you have this, something like 2/3 of fixed business investment was part of the shale revolution, very important for manufacturing in the Midwest, very important for our balance of payment, very important for job creation. So in a sense, we are both, as a leading consumer and as a leading producer of oil in the world, we're kind of on both sides of the street and, trying to assess what's the overall impact on the economy. But we have certainly kind of flexibility that Russia and Saudi Arabia don't in terms of our oil production. But, it's quite striking. When we started, Robbie, U.S. was importing 60% of its oil. Now the U.S. is still the world's #1 oil producer. This happened very fast. Shale was a really disruptive technology. I don't think it's going to be disruptive in the future because I think it's now, unless something very dramatic happens, it will continue to be part of just part of the world oil market. And sometimes when I hear people say we should ban fracking, I stop and say, well, can you tell me the next sentence? The next sentence is if you ban fracking, it means the United States is going to import a lot more oil and do it quickly because the production will go down. And we have 280 million cars that at this point, about 279 million of them run on gasoline. So I really don't, I actually scratch my head and say, why is that a good policy? If it would get you back to where we were when you started this about the risk of dependence on imported oil.
Right. I mean, the beauty of electric vehicles and of the United States and the wealth we have both in, minerals, but also oil and gas is, we have the ability to have electric vehicles and have a diverse domestic fuel source into our transportation system, never have to worry about that price. But at the same time, we could export it or we could use it for producing that electricity. So that, it makes no sense not to want to move to this. Norway has been the greatest example of that. Right here, Norway, has this largest, most wealthiest sovereign wealth fund in the world, making it from oil, but also the lowest carbon emissions per molecule because.
Right. Well, of course, two things about Norway. One is they produce electricity with hydro, which they probably could not build those plants today. The other thing, so I asked one senior Norwegian kind of why, they've had about the most generous incentives for EVs. And I asked him why, and he said, well, because we're a rich country. They decided they wanted to do it and they have the resources. The world's largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and they have 4 million people. Gives you a lot of flexibility.
But one could say that they now have more ability to export that oil to make more money, right?
Yes, that's right.
Home and export it. So to me, that's really the strategy of the United States. Use less of our oil at home, export more of it, and use electric vehicles, which both get us to those goals of security as well as better balance of payments. So, Dan, I think we're going to go. The first 4 people to email our info at our website, secureenergy.org, can get a free book. Send us your name and your address. I have one more pitch for Dan because I love being a pitch man. CIRA, which is the largest energy conference in the world that's down in Houston. You no longer need to go down to Houston, thanks to COVID. You can attend it online from March 1st to March 5th. So
Thank you.
I'll
Thank
join.
you.
I hope you'll buy the book, and thank you, Dan, for everything.
And I want to just tell people also, the pictures are great. I would tell you this is the only book on energy that has a picture of Jackie Chan in it. But all I'll say, it's connected to the Belt and Road strategy, but I won't say anything more. So anyway, Rob, it's great to be part of this, and congratulations to you and your colleagues, all who are involved in this important study.
Thank you so much, Dan.